Happy Tuesday, April 30th. Spartans, again, I'm out of the building today, so here's what we're doing. You have a DBQ to respond to on the colonization of Asia. I got a couple of slides to go through with you, should be pretty quick. And then you have the rest of the time to knock out the remaining questions on the Chapter 26 reading guide. Questions 40 through 50 due tomorrow. Chapter 26 reading guide is due tomorrow, so make sure you get that done. Let's get to it. From the weekly agenda, you'll see the link to the DBQ. The prompt, looking at the document, describe how the colonization of Asia was different from Africa. So go ahead, analyze the cartoon, answer the question, and post. Pause the video. All right, you should have that done. There's a couple of stark differences here in the colonization of Asia compared to the colonization of Africa. One, the colonization of Asia amongst European countries and the United States is a little bit more truculent in nature, a little bit more combative, competitive. That wasn't quite the case in Africa. In Africa, the European countries more or less were quite civilized in how they were going to divvy up the continent. I mean, they had a conference to more or less discuss who wants what and where, and we'll figure out a way to keep everybody happy. The Africans weren't very happy about it, but the Europeans were more or less able to peacefully divvy up the last remaining continent of the world. Asia, a little bit different than this. And here's why. European countries had been in this region for centuries by the time we get to the 19th century and 20th century. I mean, this is the first area of exploration once the European nations more or less begin the age of exploration. They go to Asia before they get to the New World. And once they discover the New World, that takes their attention off of this region. But it doesn't mean that they weren't still there, and they were still there. Um, and this very much clearly adds into the competition between European nations. This is, after being more or less kicked out of the New World by revolution, Asia is the last little hunk of land that they have to go after. Um, Another interesting difference between the imperialization or the colonization of Asia compared to Africa is, um, while in Africa it was typically European nations and governments who were divvying up the land, the colonization of Asia came as a result of European countries trying to protect their economic interests because, again, in the 17th century, 18th century, it was European countries' businesses, the East India Trading Company or the Dutch East Asia Trading Company. It was these companies that got involved there. So what allowed for this colonization to happen, for the most part, is European countries didn't get involved from a colonial perspective until their companies, their industries had already established a base and already established areas in the region. And then there was some sort of event, some sort of political instability in which the people who lived in the indigenous people who lived in these regions, whether it be the Indians or the Vietnamese or the Laotians, it doesn't really matter. When the indigenous population started to push back on how European companies were treating them while being there. This is the exact same thing that'll happen in Latin America when the United States starts getting involved. It's the exact same thing that happens in the Hawaiian Islands when the United States starts getting involved. Our country, the US, will go and get themselves involved in these politically unstable countries and more or less dictate what is going to happen solely to protect our economic interests. And that's exactly what happens throughout Asia. These are countries who are going in and protecting their businesses that are already there. And as a result of protecting their businesses that are already there, they're going to establish permanent governments that are controlled by those European countries. It begins first with India. This is exactly how the British will get into India and more or less establish permanent control for, well, until what, 1945, 1947, when India finally gets its independence. The British go there to protect their businesses. It's the exact same thing that the United States will do. It's the exact same thing that the French will do, and even the Japanese will do it with Korea. Interestingly enough, the last country that remains that is independent from any sort of European influence is the Chinese. For whatever reason, the Chinese are able to largely isolate themselves from the rest of the colonial interactions of this time period until the British are able to figure out a way in. And the British are able to figure out a way into China by making their people dependent on a export that only the British can produce, and that's opium, a drug. That's right, opioids. The British are able to crack the exterior of the Chinese empire by getting their people dependent on opium. And that is what will allow European countries to come in. And that is where European countries will start skirmishing with one another, trying to get a foothold, or at least at the very minimum, establishing spheres of influence in this region. Because it's the last country left. Another interesting thing to talk about is the Japanese, because the Japanese will also engage in imperialism, and they'll actually follow the same path that the European countries did and the United States did. It is protecting their business interests in colonial territories, or in lands that don't belong to them. And largely it begins with Korea. And what will eventually happen as we go through the remainder of the trimester and get into World War II, it's imperialism that is driving the Japanese. They'll more or less expand from the Korean Peninsula into Manchuria and then down through the remainder of China. But again, the reason why they go to war with China over Korea is because there was a rebellion in Korea. The Koreans were pushing back against the Chinese. The Japanese didn't want foreign countries involved, and not to mention they had business interests in the region. It's the exact same reason why the United States will get into a conflict with the Spanish during the Spanish-American War over Cuba. We have business interests in Cuba. We don't want to lose money because, again, as we've talked about all year long, what is the one thing that people care about? It's the economy. It's their jobs. So if all of a sudden the economy isn't making money and the economy isn't growing and people lose jobs, the government gets blamed for it. This is largely the difference between the colonization of Africa and the colonization of Asia. Colonization of Asia is about European countries protecting their economic interests, their businesses that have been established there for quite some time, and making sure they are okay during political instability throughout the continent, throughout the Asian continent. And when there is political instability in these Asian countries, that is when the European countries move in and set up more or less permanent dependent colonies that are controlled by European nations. I'm done. You have the rest of the chapter 26 reading guide 40 through 50 to do. We'll talk about that tomorrow, and then we'll talk about our final project, which will be due on Friday. Hope you're all well. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Until then, go Spartans.